Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Computer Scientist channel. Tonight we drift backward through time into the quiet revolution that changed the world forever. Not with a bang or a scream, but with simple beeps and bloops, pixelated shapes moving across screens in living rooms across America. We are travelling back to the era of the Atari 2600, a machine so humble in appearance, yet so profound in impact that it fundamentally rewrote the rules of entertainment and the very concept of what could happen inside a home. The story of the Atari 2600 is not merely the story of a video game console. It is the story of dreamers who believed that the magic of arcade games, those glowing temples of fun that stood in pizza parlours and shopping malls, could somehow be captured, shrunk down, and brought into the intimate spaces where families gathered around their television sets. It is a tale of innovation, audacity, near total failure, and miraculous recovery. It is a story of cartridges, of brilliant programmers working within impossible technical constraints, of corporate battles, and of a culture learning to play in entirely new ways. Before the Atari 2600 existed, there was no home video game console market. There were simple electronic games, crude affairs that played Pong or variations of it. People who wanted to play video games had to go out, had to insert quarters, had to stand in arcade cabinets under fluorescent lights. The idea that you could own a machine that would bring this experience home seemed impossible. The technology seemed too advanced, the cost too prohibitive, the concept too futuristic to ever be practical. And yet, in the early 1970s, a small group of visionaries in California began to wonder if the impossible might actually be achievable. The year was 1972. Personal computers were the size of refrigerators and cost as much as houses. Television sets were the dominant technology in American homes, and they were beginning to become more affordable and widespread. In the margins of Silicon Valley, amid the startups and laboratories where the microprocessor revolution was just beginning, a man named Nolan Bushnell watched the world shifting. He saw opportunity where others saw only obstacles. He envisioned a future where entertainment would be interactive, where the television would become not just a passive receiver of broadcasts, but an active participant in the home. This vision would birth an industry that did not yet exist. The Atari 2600 would not arrive until 1977, almost 5 years after these initial dreams. Those 5 years would be filled with false starts, brilliant innovations, and countless hours of work by engineers and designers who were inventing something so new that there was almost no precedent to guide them. They were not simply building a game console, they were creating the template for how video game consoles would work for the next 4 decades. Every console that would come after, from the Nintendo Entertainment System to the PlayStation to the modern machines we use today, would inherit fundamental design principles established by the Atari 2600. The technology these visionaries were working with was, by modern standards, astonishingly primitive. The processors were slow, the memory was measured in kilobytes rather than megabytes, the graphics were limited to a few colours and simple shapes. Yet it was precisely these constraints that forced a kind of creativity that would shape the entire aesthetic of early video games. Programmers had to think in entirely new ways. They had to imagine how to tell stories, create gameplay, and build worlds with almost no computational resources. The limitations became inspiration, and from this scarcity emerged some of the most elegant and beloved games ever created. Nolan Bushnell was born in 1943, during the height of World War II in the American West. He grew up fascinated by electronics and engineering, the kind of person who couldn't resist taking things apart to understand how they worked. As a teenager, he he built his own computer from spare parts, an ambitious project that speaks to the curiosity and determination that would define his life. By the time he reached the University of Utah in the 1960s, he was immersed in the earliest days of computer graphics and interactive systems. The university was one of the rare places in America where someone could learn about these emerging technologies, and Bushnell made the most of every opportunity. It was at the University of Utah where Bushnell first encountered the computer game Space War, created by MIT students in the 1960s. Space War was not a commercial product. It was a program that ran on one of the earliest computers, a massive machine that took up an entire room. And yet, when Bushnell played it, something clicked in his mind. He realized that interactive electronic entertainment had the potential to captivate people in ways that passive media could not. The game was crude by any standard, consisting of simple vector graphics and abstract representations of spaceships. But the experience of controlling something on a screen, of having your actions directly affect what happened in a digital world, was revolutionary. Bushnell knew he had glimpsed the future, and he wanted to be the one to build it. After leaving university, Bushnell worked for Ampex, a company that manufactured computer technology and video equipment. It was a respectable job that paid well, but Bushnell's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about how to bring video games into the world. He was sketching ideas for arcade cabinets, imagining the kinds of experiences that could be created if someone could figure out how to make video games commercially viable. He was not alone in these thoughts, but he had a clarity of vision and a willingness to take risks that set him apart from others who had similar dreams. In 1972, Bushnell partnered with Ted Dabney, an engineer he had met at Ampex, and together they formed a company they called Atari. The name came from a term used in the game Go, a hint that Bushnell and Dabney were thinking about strategy and the deeper possibilities of interactive entertainment. Their first product was Pong, a simple game where two players controlled paddles on either side of a screen, bouncing a ball back and forth. Pong was not the first video game, but it was the first commercial video game, the first game created specifically to be coin-operated and placed in public spaces for profit. Pong was released into a Sunnyvale, California bar, where it was housed in a wooden cabinet that looked somewhat like a cocktail table. People were mesmerized by it. They came back again and again, feeding quarters into the machine to play. Within weeks, the cabinet had made more money than anyone had anticipated. Suddenly, Bushnell and Dabney had something that worked. They had proven that people would pay to play video games. This validation gave them the confidence to expand, to imagine bigger things, to dream about how video games could reach beyond the arcade and into homes across America. But the leap from arcade cabinet to home console was not straightforward. The arcade cabinets used relatively sophisticated computers and custom-built hardware. To bring games into homes, you needed something that could connect to the televisions people already owned. The technology to make this work cheaply enough to be affordable to average consumers did not yet exist. Bushnell and his team would need to innovate, to find ways to do things more efficiently, to squeeze powerful capabilities into small, inexpensive packages. This challenge would drive much of the innovation that led to the Atari 2600. By the mid-1970s, Atari was a successful company, but Nolan Bushnell was growing restless. The arcade business was good, profitable even, but he was thinking about something bigger. He wanted to create a home console, a device that would sit under the television in millions of homes. The challenge was daunting. Home computers existed, but they were expensive and complicated. Most Americans didn't have a computer in their home, but nearly every American home had a television. What if, Bushnell thought, you could create a device that used the television as a display? What if you could make it simple enough for anyone to use and affordable enough for families to buy? Bushnell did not attempt to build the Atari 2600 from scratch. Instead, he approached established semiconductor companies with his vision. He needed someone with the manufacturing capability and the expertise to create custom chips that could power this home console. Ultimately, Atari partnered with chip manufacturer Rockwell International. However, the partnership was complicated by Bushnell's aggressive timeline and ambitious specifications. What Bushnell wanted was a machine that could play multiple games, swap between them using interchangeable cartridges, and do all this while remaining affordable and simple to use. The technical lead on the Atari 2600 project was Jay Miner, an engineer with a brilliant mind and a reputation for solving impossible problems. Miner, working with a team of talented engineers, had to make dozens of crucial decisions about the hardware architecture. The processor they chose was the EMOS Technology 6507, a stripped-down version of the processor used in many early personal computers. It was cheap, it was relatively simple to program for, and it was powerful enough to do what they needed, though just barely. The memory was extremely limited, measured in kilobytes. The graphics chip, developed specifically for the 2600, had to be incredibly efficient. Everything about the design was a study in constraint and creativity. One of the most important innovations in the Atari 2600 was the cartridge system. Instead of having games built into the console, games would come on cartridges that could be inserted and swapped out. This was not an entirely new idea, but implementing it in a way that was reliable and user-friendly was a significant engineering achievement. The cartridge had to contain the entire game, compressed and encoded in a way that the limited hardware could read and execute. The cartridge slot had to be durable, reliable, and easy to use. Customers had to be able to insert a cartridge without thinking about it, without worrying about damage or complications. The design of the Atari 2600 itself reflected the era in which it was created. The machine was housed in a wood grain or faux teak plastic case, which gave it a warmth and approachability that contrasted with the sleek chrome and black of modern electronics. The controllers were simple, with a joystick in the center and a single red button for the primary action. The console itself was relatively compact, small enough to fit in an entertainment center without dominating the space. Everything about its appearance was designed to make it feel like it belonged in a home, not in an arcade. This was crucial. For the Atari 2600 to succeed, it had to be perceived not as a piece of arcade equipment, but as a legitimate home entertainment device. The team worked against tight deadlines and faced numerous technical obstacles. There were problems with heat dissipation, issues with the power supply, challenges in getting the graphics chip to perform reliably. There were moments when it seemed like the whole project might fail, when the ambitious goals seemed impossible to achieve with the available technology. But the team persevered. They made compromises where necessary, innovated where possible, and slowly, over months of work, the Atari 2600 began to take shape. The Atari 2600 was first introduced to the market in September 1977 at a price point of $199. In 1977 dollars, this was a significant purchase, equivalent to around $900 in modern currency. The console came with a joystick controller, a power adapter, and 2 games, Combat and Surround. Combat was an adaptation of a tank battle game, while Surround was a simple Pong-like experience. The marketing emphasized that the machine could play multiple games, each on its own cartridge. This was radical. Home entertainment systems before this point generally had one or two functions. The idea that the same machine could provide dozens or hundreds of different experiences was genuinely novel. The initial response to the Atari 2600 was mixed. The gaming audience that understood what the machine offered was enthusiastic. People who had played games in arcades and wanted to experience something similar at home saw the potential immediately. But for many consumers, the concept was confusing. Why would you need a special machine just to play games? Couldn't you play games on your computer? The computer market was rapidly expanding, and many people were beginning to see computers as the future of home entertainment. The Atari 2600 had to compete for attention and shelf space against personal computers that could do many different things. The early sales of the Atari 2600 were disappointing. The machine sold perhaps a few 100,000 units in its first year, which was far below what the company had hoped for. Atari had invested heavily in manufacturing capacity, had produced thousands of consoles in anticipation of massive demand, and now faced the reality that demand was much slower than expected. The company was burning through cash. There were questions about whether the Atari 2600 would ever become a mass-market success, or whether it would remain a niche product for hardcore gaming enthusiasts. One of the key factors that kept the Atari 2600 alive during these difficult early years was the release of new games. While Combat and Surround were decent titles, they didn't inspire people to run out and buy the console. But in 1978, Atari released Adventure, a game that would become legendary in the history of video games. Adventure was created by Warren Robinett, a programmer who pushed the limits of what the Atari 2600 hardware could do. Adventure presented a fantasy world where the player controlled a small square character, moving through a landscape filled with threats and mysteries. It had a narrative structure that games had not really had before. There was a goal, a challenge to overcome, and a sense of exploration and discovery. For many players, Adventure was the moment when the Atari 2600 clicked into focus as something genuinely worthwhile. Throughout 1978 and 1979, the situation gradually improved. More games were released. More people heard about the Atari 2600 through word of mouth. The technology press began to take the machine seriously. Slowly, the sales figures began to climb. The console that had seemed like a risky investment was beginning to look like it might actually have a future. But the real transformation would come with a single game. A game that would change everything. That game was Space Invaders, and its release would define the trajectory of the Atari 2600 for the remainder of the decade. Space Invaders was not created by Atari. It was originally an arcade game, released in Japan in 1978 by a company called Taito. The game presented rows of alien invaders moving across the screen in formation, dropping down slowly and accelerating as they were destroyed. The player controlled a small ship at the bottom of the screen, moving left and right to avoid enemy fire and shooting upward to destroy the invaders. It was simple, addictive, and endlessly challenging. Space Invaders became the first genuine arcade phenomenon, drawing millions of players to arcades and generating enormous revenue for Taito and the arcade cabinet manufacturers who licensed the game. Atari secured the rights to create a home version of Space Invaders for the Atari 2600. This was a massive undertaking. The arcade version used custom hardware specifically designed to render the graphics and animate the aliens. The Atari 2600 hardware was far less powerful. The programmer assigned to the task was Rick Maurer, and later others joined the project. They faced an enormous challenge. How could they recreate the Space Invaders experience on hardware that was roughly 100 times less powerful than the arcade cabinet? The solution involved what can only be described as programming wizardry. The Atari 2600 programmers had to use techniques that pushed every capability of the hardware to its absolute limit. They had to be incredibly clever about how they managed memory, how they rendered graphics, how they organized the code. The Space Invaders in the home version didn't look exactly like the arcade version. They were simpler, more abstract. But the essence of the game was there. The tension of facing down advancing waves of enemies, the satisfaction of destroying them, the escalating challenge as waves got harder, all of this translated to the home console. When Space Invaders was released for the Atari 2600 in 1980, the impact was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, people who didn't have access to arcades, or who wanted to play the game at home, could do so. The game was bundled with some console packages, and it drove console sales to unprecedented levels. In the months following the release of Space Invaders for the Atari 2600, the console became a must-have item. Parents who had never heard of video games were purchasing Atari 2600s for their children. The machine went from marginal to mainstream in a matter of weeks. The initial production shortages that had seemed like a crisis suddenly became clear evidence of massive demand. The Space Invaders phenomenon transformed the Atari 2600 from an interesting experiment into the dominant entertainment device in American homes. The console that had nearly failed was suddenly becoming one of the most successful consumer electronics products in history. By the end of 1980, Atari had sold several million units of the 2600. The software library was expanding rapidly. Third-party developers were creating games for the system. The home video game market, which had barely existed 2 years earlier, was suddenly an enormous and rapidly growing industry. However, success brings its own challenges. The rapid growth of the market attracted competitors. Other companies saw the success of the Atari 2600 and wanted a piece of the market. Mattel released the Intellivision, a console that was technically more powerful than the Atari 2600 and offered games with more sophisticated graphics and sound. Coleco released the ColecoVision, another technically advanced console. Numerous other competitors entered the market with their own offerings. The market that had been dominated by Atari was now crowded with competition. The industry was expanding so rapidly that it was difficult to predict what would happen next. As the Atari 2600 moved through the early 1980s, an extraordinary library of games began to accumulate. Some were ports of arcade games, adapted from the original cabinet versions. Others were original creations designed specifically for the home console. Some were masterpieces of game design, elegant in their simplicity and brilliant in their execution. Others were simple, even crude, but enjoyed by millions who loved them nonetheless. Together, these games created an entire culture of home gaming. Pac-Man, released for the Atari 2600 in 1982, was one of the most anticipated game releases of the era. Like Space Invaders, Pac-Man had been a massive arcade hit, and the home version was eagerly anticipated. The Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man was not identical to the arcade version. The maze was different, the animations were simpler, some of the behaviour of the ghosts was altered, but it was Pac-Man, and for most players, that was enough. Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 became one of the best-selling games on the platform, and it remains iconic to this day. Asteroids, another arcade hit, was adapted for the Atari 2600 and became hugely popular. Defender, Robotron, Donkey Kong, Dig Dug, Centipede, one after another, the great arcade games of the early 1980s were adapted for the home console. But the Atari 2600 library was not only arcade adaptations. Original games created specifically for the platform also flourished. Pitfall, released in 1982, was an action game where the player controlled a treasure hunter navigating a jungle filled with obstacles and enemies. Pitfall was enormously successful, spawning sequels and becoming one of the defining games of the platform. Frogger brought the arcade experience of guiding a frog across traffic and through water to the home console. River Raid, an action game where the player flew a plane down a river, shooting enemies and avoiding obstacles, became a classic. Yas' Revenge, an action game exclusive to the Atari 2600, was designed by a programmer named Howard Scott Warshaw and became one of the most celebrated games on the platform. Chopper Command, Demon Attack, Phoenix. The list of memorable games grew and grew. The most celebrated game designer for the Atari 2600 was arguably Carol Shaw, one of the first women to work in video game programming. Shaw designed Picross and River Raid, both excellent games that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of game design within the constraints of the hardware. Shaw's work showed that the Atari 2600, despite its technical limitations, could be a vehicle for creative and engaging game design. Each of these games represented countless hours of work by programmers, designers, and artists, all working to push the capabilities of the hardware to its limit. The programmers had to be incredibly clever and resourceful. A typical Atari 2600 game cartridge might contain only 4 kilobytes of ROM, an impossibly small amount of space by modern standards. Everything had to fit: the game code, the data structures that represented the game world, the graphics, the sound. These constraints forced a kind of elegant simplicity that, in hindsight, contributed greatly to the game's charm and playability. The sound designers for Atari 2600 games worked with the sound chip that could produce only the most basic synthesized sounds. There were no recorded samples, no complex musical compositions. The sounds were generated in real time by the hardware, often simple beeps and boops that somehow became iconic and beloved. The theme from Pac-Man, translated to the Atari 2600 and filtered through the limitations of the hardware, became instantly recognizable. The laser sounds of Space Invaders, the jump sound from Donkey Kong, the beeping tones of countless other games became part of the cultural fabric of the early 1980s. By the early 1980s, the Atari 2600 had achieved cultural dominance. It was not uncommon for a home to have an Atari 2600. Parents who had never played a video game in their lives were setting up consoles for their children. Arcades still flourished, but the home console was becoming the primary venue for video gaming for many people. The games were ubiquitous in popular culture. Atari 2600 games appeared in movies and television shows. The controllers and cartridges became instantly recognizable symbols of the era. The economic impact of the Atari 2600 was staggering. Atari, which had been a company primarily focused on arcade cabinets, was now earning the vast majority of its revenue from the home console and its games. Atari stock soared. The company was valued at over $1 billion at its peak. Other companies saw the success and scrambled to enter the market. The home video game market grew so rapidly that it was difficult for any single company to dominate it. Yet for several years in the early 1980s, Atari was essentially synonymous with video games for most Americans. To have a video game console meant, almost certainly, to have an Atari 2600. The early 1980s were halcyon days for the video game industry and for Atari in particular, but nothing lasts forever, and the trajectory that had seemed to point only upward began to curve downward. By 1983, it became apparent that something was deeply wrong with the home video game market. Sales were slowing. Consumers who had rushed to buy Atari 2600s were no longer upgrading to compete with newer consoles. The market was becoming saturated. Too many games were being released, and many of them were of poor quality. The software quality was wildly inconsistent, ranging from genuine classics to games that were barely playable. The causes of the crash were multiple and interconnected. First, there was the simple reality of market saturation. Anyone who wanted an Atari 2600 had already bought one. The replacement market wasn't enough to sustain the kind of growth rates that investors had become accustomed to. Second, the arcade market was being disrupted. Arcades were becoming less central to gaming culture. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the quality of software was becoming a significant issue. Atari had become less selective about which games were licensed for the system. Publishers were rushing out games quickly to capitalize on the market, and the quality reflected the haste. The situation was exacerbated by a particularly egregious example of poor game design: Atari's own version of Pac-Man. The arcade version of Pac-Man was a masterpiece of game design. But Atari's version for the 2600 had significant problems. The mazes were different, the ghosts behaved differently, and for many players, something essential about the experience was lost. Players had very specific expectations about what Pac-Man should be, and when the home version didn't meet those expectations, it was disappointing. Many players felt like Atari had betrayed them, released an inferior product and charged full price for it. Perhaps even more infamous was Atari's version of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, based on the Steven Spielberg film. The game was rushed to market to capitalize on the popularity of the movie. The game was difficult to understand, frustrating to play, and generally considered one of the worst games ever released. Copies of E.T. sold poorly, and it became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the video game industry during this period. Years later, there would be urban legends about enormous warehouses filled with unsold E.T. cartridges being buried in the desert, though the truth of this story remains debated. The problem was that there were too many games, too many terrible games, and not enough differentiation between them. When consumers had choice, they were often making poor decisions, purchasing games that were disappointing. This led to consumer skepticism about the entire medium. Parents who had bought Atari 2600s for their children began to question the purchase. Why spend money on games that were often unplayable or boring? Video games were starting to seem like a fad, something that had been popular but might not be here to stay. The competition from other consoles made the situation worse. The Intellivision and ColecoVision were, in technical terms, superior to the Atari 2600. They had more powerful processors, more memory, better graphics capabilities. Atari's dominance was being challenged. The Atari 2600 had been the clear market leader, but now there were legitimate competitors offering better technology at similar price points. For consumers, the question became, if you're going to buy a console, why buy the technically inferior Atari 2600? The result was a crash so severe that it nearly destroyed the home video game industry entirely. In 1983, the North American home video game market contracted by approximately 97%. The market went from billions of dollars in annual revenue to nearly nothing. Major retailers stopped carrying video game consoles. Companies that had entered the market in the boom years suddenly found themselves unable to sell their inventory. Atari's stock price collapsed. The company that had seemed invincible suddenly appeared to be in existential crisis. The crash affected not just Atari, but the entire industry. Video game companies went bankrupt. The Intellivision and ColecoVision, which had been positioned to challenge the Atari 2600's dominance, saw their markets evaporate. Even companies like Mattel and Coleco, major toy companies with significant resources, struggled to survive the crash. The home video game industry, which had seemed poised to become one of the dominant entertainment mediums of the era, now seemed like it might be dead. For Atari, the situation was particularly dire. The company had reinvented itself around home video games. The arcade business still existed, but it was no longer the company's primary focus. If the home console market was truly dead, Atari's future was in serious question. The company had to rapidly adjust its business model, cut costs, and figure out how to survive. Nolan Bushnell, who had left Atari in the late 1970s, was no longer guiding the company. The company was in the hands of different leadership, and the decisions they made in the next months would determine whether Atari would survive the crash or become another casualty of the market collapse. Atari's salvation came from an unlikely source: Japan. In Japan, the video game market had also crashed, but the crash had been less severe and shorter-lived. A company called Nintendo, which had been in the toy and entertainment business for decades, decided to enter the home video game market. Nintendo had learned from the mistakes that had led to the crash in North America. They were stringent about game quality. They had built a sophisticated quality control process to ensure that only games that met their standards would be released for their console. They managed the supply of games carefully, creating scarcity rather than glut, and they had licensing agreements that gave them control over the market. Nintendo's console was called the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. It was not technically superior to the Atari 2600 in the way that the Intellivision and ColecoVision had been. But it was a new design, based on different technology and uncomplicated by the association with the crash. More importantly, Nintendo had excellent games. Super Mario Bros., created by legendary game designer Shigeru Miyamoto, was a masterpiece. It showed that video games could be imaginative, engaging, and fun in ways that earlier games had not fully explored. Super Mario Bros. Was bundled with the NES in North America, and it drove console sales. The NES began to gain market share in North America. Parents and consumers, who'd been burned by the poor quality of games on the Atari 2600 and other consoles, were willing to give video games another chance if the quality was genuinely better. Nintendo's strict quality control policy made a difference. The NES library had fewer games overall compared to the Atari 2600 at its peak, but the games were generally of higher quality. Consumers noticed, and they responded. As Nintendo's market share grew, Atari's situation became increasingly precarious. The Atari 2600 was still being sold, and there was still a market for it, but it was no longer the dominant console. The Atari 5200, a technically advanced console that Atari had released as a successor to the 2600, had failed in the market. Atari's strategy had been to move upmarket, to compete with the Intellivision and ColecoVision with a more advanced machine. But the timing was terrible. The 5200 was released just as the crash was beginning, and it never gained significant market share. For the Atari 2600 though, something interesting happened. Despite the collapse of the broader market, the console had a persistent appeal. There was still a core audience of consumers who wanted to play Atari 2600 games. The machine had been on the market for years. It was affordable, it had a large library of games, and for budget-conscious consumers, it remained an attractive option. As the initial panic of the crash subsided and the market began to recover around the NS, the Atari 2600 found itself in a new position. It was no longer the cutting-edge console, it was no longer aspirational, but it was also no longer expensive. It became a budget console, an entry point into gaming for consumers who didn't want or couldn't afford to pay the premium price for a NES. Atari began to reposition the Atari 2600 in the market accordingly. prices were dropped significantly. The console became a common sight in discount stores and Christmas bargain bins. New cartridges continued to be released, though the pace had slowed. The console, rather than being a centerpiece of the gaming industry, became a kind of afterthought, a product that was still sold but was clearly past its prime. Yet in a strange way, this demotion saved the Atari 2600. The console was able to limp along for years because it was inexpensive and had a huge existing library of games. Consumers who couldn't afford a NES could still enjoy video gaming with an inexpensive Atari 2600 purchase. The console that had nearly been obliterated by the crash became, paradoxically, one of the things that helped stabilize the market by providing an affordable option for consumers. Atari itself was eventually purchased by Jack Tramiel, a businessperson who had previously founded Commodore. Tramiel's influence stabilized the company and helped it survive, even if it never regained its former glory. Throughout the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, the Atari 2600 was a fading star. The NES dominated the market. Later, the Super Nintendo and Genesis consoles became the hot new systems that consumers were buying. The Atari 2600 was increasingly considered retro, old technology from the early days of video gaming, and yet the console refused to fade completely away. Atari continued to produce the machine, manufacturers continued to churn out new cartridges at a slow pace, and consumers continued to buy the system. The original Atari 2600, released in 1977, was a marvel of engineering, but it was not without its limitations and quirks. The engineers at Atari understood these limitations perhaps better than anyone, and over the course of the console's long life, numerous hardware revisions were made to address problems, reduce manufacturing costs, and improve the user experience. These revisions tell a story of continuous incremental improvement, of a company trying to extend the life of a product through thoughtful engineering rather than revolutionary change. The first major revision came in 1982, what collectors now call the Atari 2600 Junior, though it was not officially called that at the time. This revision was designed to reduce manufacturing costs. The original 2600 used discrete logic chips in its design, meaning that different functions of the console were performed by separate chips. The revised version replaced many of these discrete chips with a smaller number of more integrated chips. This made the console cheaper to manufacture, reduced the number of components that could fail, and in general made the hardware more reliable. Cosmetically, the new version looked very similar to the original, though some people prefer the aesthetics of the original wood grain finish to the updated design. The 1982 revision made another significant change. The video output was improved slightly, addressing some of the quality issues that had plagued the original console. The original 2600 produced a video signal that was adequate but not ideal, and the quality of the image on the television screen was dependent on the quality of the television and the cable connections. The revised version produced a cleaner signal, which made the games look slightly better on most television sets. This was a subtle improvement, but it mattered to consumers who cared about image quality. Throughout the 1980s, Atari released various other revisions and variants of the 2600. There was a version called the Atari 2600 Junior, sometimes informally called the Darth Vader 2600 because of its black colouring and angular design that some people thought resembled a stormtrooper helmet. This version was released in 1986 in an attempt to revitalise sales during the period when the NES was beginning to dominate the market. The Junior was less expensive to manufacture than the earlier versions and was sold at a lower price point, making it an attractive option for budget-conscious consumers. The Junior had a cleaner, more modern design than the original. though some collectors and nostalgic gamers prefer the warmth of the original design. The different hardware revisions of the 2600 all played the same games and were essentially interchangeable from a consumer perspective. However, the revisions differed in their construction quality and long-term reliability. The earliest versions of the 2600, produced in 1977 and 1978, are known to develop problems over time. The power supply in the original version is particularly notorious for failing after many years of use. The revised versions addressed many of these reliability issues. From a collector's perspective, this means that finding an original 1977 or 1978 2600 that still works perfectly is a significant achievement. The later versions are generally more reliable and more durable. The controllers for the Atari 2600 also went through various iterations and improvements. The original joystick controller was simple but durable. The joystick itself was actually quite fragile, and many people who used the console extensively would find that the joystick would begin to wear out after months or years of heavy use. The stick would become loose or jerky, making it difficult to control games precisely. This was actually a design flaw that plagued the Atari 2600 throughout its life. Third-party companies sold replacement joysticks and alternative controllers designed to be more durable than the original. Some of these alternatives, like the CX40 joystick, became quite popular among dedicated gamers. The Atari 2600 software library is a vast and diverse collection of games, numbering in the hundreds. The quality and character of these games changed dramatically over the lifespan of the console. The early games, released in the years immediately following the console's launch, were often adaptations of arcade games or simple original creations designed to showcase the capabilities of the hardware. As time went on, and programmers became more familiar with the hardware, the games became more sophisticated and creative, even while working within the same technical constraints. The golden age of Atari 2600 gaming, roughly from 1980 to 1983, produced some of the most iconic and beloved games in the history of video games. These are games that are still played and celebrated today, more than 40 years after their original release. Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Asteroids, Missile Command, Defender, Donkey Kong, Pitfall, Frogger, Adventure, Yar's Revenge. These games defined what the Atari 2600 was and what video gaming meant to millions of people. But the library was not only masterpieces. There were also countless games of varying quality, games that range from excellent to mediocre to genuinely terrible. Some games were released in such small quantities that they became rare and valuable to collectors. Other games were released in massive quantities and could be found in bargain bins for $1 or less. Some games were licensed versions of popular arcade titles. Others were original creations designed specifically for the home console. Some were serious, attempting to tell stories or present meaningful challenges. Others were silly, designed purely to be fun or to exploit consumer impulses. River Raid, created by Carol Shaw, demonstrated that thoughtful game design was possible within the constraints of the Atari 2600 hardware. The game presented an endless scrolling landscape where the player piloted a helicopter down a river, shooting enemies and avoiding obstacles. The simplicity of the design belied a sophisticated understanding of pacing and difficulty progression. Similarly, Chopper Command and Demon Attack, though created by different designers, showed that the 2600 could support action games of genuine quality and depth. As time progressed and the market crashed and recovered, the nature of the software being released for the Atari 2600 changed. In the early 1980s, publishers were highly selective about which games they would release. Major publishers like Mattel, Coleco, and Activision would only release games that they believed had commercial potential. The crash of 1983 changed this dramatically. As the market recovered, dominated now by the NES and other new consoles, the Atari 2600 became a secondary market. Publishers that couldn't compete on the cutting-edge systems would sometimes release games for the 2600, knowing that there was still an audience, albeit a smaller one, willing to purchase them. This led to an interesting period in the 1990s where the Atari 2600 received games from small publishers and independent developers. Some of these games were quite good, but many were released more out of desperation than quality control. The Atari 2600 became a refuge for developers who couldn't get their games onto the NES or Super Nintendo. This actually contributed to the console's longevity. The diversity of the software library meant that there was always something new to discover, even for players who'd been gaming on the 2600 for years. Some of the most interesting Atari 2600 games are the ones that attempted to do things that the hardware really wasn't designed to do. Games that tried to squeeze complex graphics onto a screen that could display limited colours and simple shapes. Games that attempted to convey deep narratives or complex stories with minimal text and crude visuals. These games were often flawed, sometimes significantly so, but they demonstrated the ambition and creativity of the developers. They showed that even with severe hardware limitations, creative minds could push against the boundaries and create experiences that were memorable and meaningful. The Atari 2600 library included games in virtually every genre: action games, sports games, puzzle games, strategy games, adventure games, role-playing games. The diversity was remarkable given the technical limitations of the hardware. Some of the sports games licensed from real sports properties became popular among casual players. Some of the puzzle games found audiences among players who preferred cerebral challenges to action and reflexes. The Atari 2600 proved that you didn't need cutting-edge graphics or complex audio to create engaging gameplay. A well-designed game on the 2600 could be just as engaging as a graphically superior game on a more powerful system. One of the fascinating aspects of the Atari 2600's history is the thriving market for bootleg and unlicensed games. From the beginning, the Atari 2600 cartridge format was relatively simple and not heavily protected against unauthorized manufacturers. Atari attempted to control the market for games through licensing agreements with third-party publishers, but enforcement was imperfect. Various companies, particularly overseas manufacturers in Asia, began producing cartridges for the Atari 2600 without authorization or license. Some of these bootleggers were straightforward pirates, creating unauthorized copies of existing Atari 2600 games and selling them at discount prices. Others were more creative, modifying existing games or creating entirely new games specifically designed to sell at low prices through discount channels. The bootleg market was particularly prevalent in the years after the crash, when the video game market was recovering but consumers were price-conscious and looking for bargains. The bootleg games were often of questionable quality. Many of them were modified versions of existing games, with the titles changed or minor tweaks made to the gameplay. Some were completely original creations, often strange and bizarre games that had little in common with the legitimate Atari 2600 software. Some bootleggers would package multiple games onto a single cartridge, creating multi-game cartridges that contained simplified or altered versions of popular titles. For collectors today, these bootleg cartridges are interesting artifacts of the Atari 2600 era. They represent a period when the market was less regulated and less controlled by corporations. They demonstrate the ingenuity and entrepreneurship of individuals who saw opportunities in the gaps left by official manufacturers. While bootlegging is now generally condemned as a form of piracy, in the context of the Atari 2600 era, it represented a kind of wild, uncontrolled market freedom that older gamers often look back on with nostalgia. The Atari 2600 hardware had severe limitations compared to the arcade cabinets that inspired so many of its games. These limitations forced programmers to be creative and innovative. A typical Atari 2600 game cartridge contained at most 4 kilobytes of ROM, an absurdly small amount of space by modern standards. The RAM was even more limited, typically 128 bytes, which had to store all the information about the current state of the game world. The processor ran at 1.19 MHz, millions of times slower than modern processors. The graphics display was limited to a resolution of 160 × 192 pixels, with a limited color palette. These constraints meant that programmers had to be incredibly efficient. Every byte of code had to count. Every cycle of the processor had to be used wisely. The solutions that programmers came up with to work within these constraints often became legendary examples of programming cleverness. Some programmers would use self-modifying code, writing algorithms that actually modified their own instructions as they ran, in order to save space. Others would use lookup tables and mathematical tricks to generate graphics on the fly, rather than storing them statically. The technical documents and oral histories of Atari 2600 game development are filled with stories of programmers finding clever hacks and workarounds to solve seemingly impossible problems. One of the most interesting and controversial aspects of Atari 2600 graphics is the flicker that appears in many games. Because the Atari 2600 could only display a limited number of animated objects on the screen at the same time, programmers often had to make difficult choices about how to display multiple objects. One solution was to alternate between displaying different objects on successive frames, creating the illusion of multiple objects being displayed simultaneously, even though technically only one or two were being drawn at any given time. This technique created a flickering effect that is immediately recognizable to anyone who grew up playing Atari 2600 games. Rather than being perceived as a flaw, the flicker became an accepted part of the aesthetic of Atari 2600 games. Players learned to look through the flicker and see the game beneath it. The sound design of Atari 2600 games was similarly constrained by the hardware. The sound chip could produce only simple synthesized tones. There were no samples, no recorded sounds. Everything had to be generated in real time by the hardware. Despite these limitations, or perhaps because of them, the sound design of Atari 2600 games has an iconic quality. The beeps and boops of Pac-Man, the laser sounds of Space Invaders, the musical themes of Pitfall, and other games became instantly recognizable and beloved. The simplicity and distinctiveness of Atari 2600 sounds made them memorable and unique. Modern video game composers still sometimes draw inspiration from the limited sonic palette of the Atari 2600, recognizing that the constraints actually contributed to the memorability of the sounds. The visual style of Atari 2600 games, with their crude pixelated graphics and limited color palettes, has also aged remarkably well. Rather than looking dated or primitive, the graphics have taken on a kind of retro charm. Games from the Atari 2600 era are often held up as examples of elegant game design, where the constraints forced designers to focus on the core gameplay rather than on impressive graphics. In many ways, the technical limitations of the Atari 2600 were artistically beneficial. They forced a purity of design that is hard to achieve when designers have unlimited resources. For over a decade, the Atari 2600 remained in production, even as new consoles came and went and the gaming landscape transformed around it. But eventually, even Atari's seemingly inexhaustible patience with the aging console came to an end. Production of the Atari 2600 slowed dramatically through the late 1980s and early 1990s. By the mid-1990s, official production had ceased. Atari no longer manufactured the console or released new games for it. The Atari 2600 had, officially, reached the end of its life. However, the console's death was more of a fade than a dramatic ending. Retailers continued to sell existing stock for years after production had ended. The used market for Atari 2600 consoles and games was robust. Many people who wanted to buy an Atari 2600 in the mid-1990s could still find one, either new old stock or used. The console had achieved such cultural penetration and had such a large installed base that it simply refused to disappear completely from the market. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Atari 2600 had become definitively retro. It was no longer something you would buy as a primary gaming console. It was something you might buy for nostalgia, to recapture the experience of your childhood gaming, or as a collector's item. But there was still a market, albeit a niche one. Enthusiasts and collectors actively sought out Atari 2600 consoles and games. The console that had seemed so advanced in 1977 had become a historical artifact, a piece of gaming history to be preserved and celebrated. As the Atari 2600 faded from mainstream consciousness, a vibrant collectors' community developed around it. Enthusiasts began to actively acquire and preserve Atari 2600 consoles, cartridges, and accessories. The collector's market became increasingly sophisticated, with prices for rare games and first edition consoles climbing significantly. A sealed, unopened copy of a rare game like Phoenix or Defender could sell for hundreds or thousands of dollars. Early production run consoles in pristine condition became valuable collectibles. The collector community became deeply invested in understanding the history of the Atari 2600. Researchers and enthusiasts dug into archives, conducted oral histories with programmers and designers, and documented the technical details of the hardware and software. This work was crucial for preserving the history of the console and ensuring that the stories and knowledge associated with it would not be lost. The preservation efforts extended beyond simply accumulating and storing physical consoles and cartridges. Enthusiasts and academics became interested in preserving the software through emulation and archival. Computer emulators were created that could run Atari 2600 games on modern computers, ensuring that the games could be played and experienced even if original hardware became scarce or unreliable. Organizations like the Video Game History Foundation and the National Video Game Museum began to actively preserve Atari 2600 materials as cultural and historical artifacts. The influence of the Atari 2600 on the video game industry cannot be overstated. The console established many of the conventions and patterns that would become standard for video game consoles for decades. The cartridge-based system became the dominant model for home consoles well into the 1990s. The idea of a single base unit that could play multiple games was revolutionary, and the success of the Atari 2600 improving this model viable influenced every subsequent console design. The developers who learned their craft on the Atari 2600 went on to have enormous influence in the industry. Many of the programmers, designers, and artists who worked on Atari 2600 games became legends in the industry, and their contributions were recognized and celebrated. Designers like Carol Shaw, Warren Robinette, and others became known as pioneers. the techniques they developed for working within constraints became foundational principles of game design. The idea that limitations can be artistically and creatively beneficial became a principle that influenced game design for generations. The commercial success of the Atari 2600 also demonstrated that there was a mass market for video games. Before the 2600, video games were a niche product for arcade enthusiasts. The success of the console in bringing video games into millions of homes proved that video gaming could be a mainstream entertainment medium. This opened the door for huge investments in the video game industry, for the development of increasingly powerful hardware, and for the creation of the multi-billion-dollar video game industry that exists today. The Atari 2600 holds a special place in popular culture because it was the first video game console owned by millions of people. For an entire generation of people born in the late 1960s and 1970s, the Atari 2600 was their first experience with video gaming. These people grew up with the console, played it in their homes, shared games with friends, and have memories of the Atari 2600 that are deeply intertwined with their childhoods. This generational connection has led to intense nostalgia around the Atari 2600. As the people who grew up with the console have reached adulthood and middle age, many have maintained an affection for the games and experiences of their youth. This nostalgia has translated into continued interest in Atari 2600 games and culture. Modern remakes and re-releases of classic Atari 2600 games are popular. Emulators that allow playing Atari 2600 games on modern devices are widely available and actively used. Fan communities dedicated to the console remain active and engaged, sharing memories, knowledge, and new fan-created content. The Atari 2600 has also influenced popular culture more broadly. References to Atari 2600 games appear in movies, television shows, and popular music. The simple, recognizable graphics of Atari 2600 games are used as shorthand for retro or nostalgic in contemporary media. The aesthetic of pixel art, which has connections to the limitations of early video game graphics, has become fashionable in contemporary visual culture. Young people who never owned an Atari 2600 are sometimes drawn to the games and culture of the console because of its retro appeal and the genuine quality of many of the games. One of the most important aspects of the Atari 2600's legacy is how its technical specifications and architecture have been preserved and made accessible through emulation and preservation efforts. The Atari 2600 has been extensively studied and documented. The hardware has been reverse engineered by enthusiasts and researchers. The architecture of the processor, the memory systems, and the graphics display have all been thoroughly analysed and understood. This detailed technical knowledge has made it possible to create accurate software emulators of the Atari 2600. These emulators can run on modern computers and can faithfully reproduce the experience of playing games on an original console. The emulators have become so sophisticated that they can reproduce not just the gameplay, but also the quirks and artifacts of the original hardware, including things like flicker and the peculiarities of the sound synthesis. Emulation has been crucial for preservation because it ensures that Atari 2600 games can be experienced even if original hardware becomes scarce or fails. It also makes the games accessible to people who don't own original hardware, which has contributed to the continued popularity and appreciation of the games. Emulation has allowed researchers and enthusiasts to study the technical aspects of the games, understand how programmers solve specific problems, and document the history of game development on the platform. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of the Atari 2600's legacy is that it continues to have an active and creative fan community, even decades after the console stopped being manufactured. enthusiasts continue to write new games for the Atari 2600. These homebrew games are created by hobby programmers and released on custom cartridges to a niche but dedicated audience. The homebrew scene demonstrates the enduring appeal of the Atari 2600 as a platform. Despite being over 40 years old, the console remains attractive to some programmers as a creative challenge. The constraints of the hardware, which forced innovation in the early days, continue to appeal to modern programmers who are interested in learning about the fundamentals of game design and programming. Creating a game for the Atari 2600 requires a deep understanding of low-level programming and hardware architecture, knowledge that is not commonly acquired in modern software education. New Atari 2600 games created by hobbyists demonstrate that the fundamental design principles of the console remain valid. A well-designed game for the Atari 2600 can be just as engaging and enjoyable as any modern game. The limitations of the hardware no longer feel like constraints, but rather like interesting artistic choices. A modern homebrew game might use the color limitations and pixel art style intentionally, as aesthetic choices rather than necessity, creating a work that is deliberately retro but also deliberately artistic. The Atari 2600 has found new relevance in modern education and in the study of game design. Universities and educational institutions sometimes use the Atari 2600 as a teaching tool for understanding game design, computer architecture, and the history of interactive media. The simplicity of the hardware and the clarity of the constraints make it an ideal platform for teaching fundamental concepts in computer science and game design. Students learning to program might write their first game for the Atari 2600 as an educational exercise. This experience teaches them about efficient programming, resource management, and problem solving under constraints. It also connects them to the history of video games and helps them understand how the foundations of modern gaming were laid. The experience of working within the severe limitations of the Atari 2600 hardware often impresses upon students the importance of careful planning and efficient use of resources, lessons that have continued relevance in modern software development. Researchers and historians of technology have also become interested in the Atari 2600 as a case study in technological innovation, market dynamics, and consumer culture. The story of the Atari 2600, from revolutionary innovation to market dominance to near-total collapse and recovery, provides fascinating insights into how technology markets develop, how innovations can change consumer behavior, and how established products can survive even in the face of superior competitors. The Atari 2600 has become a cultural touchstone and frequently appears in contemporary media as a symbol of retro gaming and 1980s nostalgia. Movies and television shows that are set in the 1980s or that want to evoke that era often include Atari 2600 consoles as props. The visual appearance of the console, with its distinctive wood-grain finish and simple controller, is instantly recognizable to most people who grew up in the 1980s and has become iconic shorthand for that era. The Atari 2600 and its games has been referenced in songs, featured in music videos, and inspired artwork by contemporary artists. The simple, blocky graphics of Atari 2600 games have been reproduced, remixed, and reinterpreted by artists interested in exploring the aesthetic of early digital culture. The games themselves are sometimes cited as inspiration for modern indie games that deliberately adopt retro aesthetics and gameplay styles reminiscent of the early home console era. Documentaries and books about the history of video games invariably devote significant attention to the Atari 2600. The story of how the console nearly destroyed the video game industry and then was crucial to its recovery is a compelling narrative that resonates with audiences interested in technological history and market dynamics. The personalities associated with the console, particularly Nolan Bushnell as the visionary founder, have become celebrated figures in the history of technology and entrepreneurship. For serious Atari 2600 collectors, hunting for rare games has become something approaching an obsession. Certain games, released in extremely limited quantities or only in specific regions, have become incredibly valuable. A sealed, unopened copy of the game Defender for the Atari 2600 can sell for thousands of dollars. Other games like Asteroids and Space Invaders in their original packaging are also worth significant money. The rarity of some games is due to various factors. Some games were released late in the console's life when fewer units were being sold, resulting in limited production runs. Some games were released only in certain regions, making them scarce in other parts of the world. Some games had high failure rates, with many copies failing over the years, making mint condition examples extremely rare. Some games were controversial or had limited appeal, resulting in small sales numbers and thus low production volumes. The hunt for rare Atari 2600 games has created an interesting secondary market. Collectors actively search for rare games, paying premium prices when they find them. Online marketplaces and auction sites have made it possible for collectors around the world to connect and trade rare cartridges. Estate sales and antique shops sometimes contain unexpected treasures in the form of Atari 2600 games. There are stories of collectors finding mint condition games in garage sales or thrift stores for a few dollars, then reselling them for hundreds or thousands. The modern retro gaming movement, which has become increasingly popular and mainstream in recent years, has deep roots in the Atari 2600. The console was one of the first gaming platforms to become retro, and the revival of interest in the 2600 in the 1990s and 2000s was in many ways the beginning of the broader retro gaming movement. Modern retro gaming includes playing original hardware on original televisions, which has led to increased interest in finding and restoring Atari 2600 consoles. People who want to experience Atari 2600 games exactly as they were played in the 1980s seek out original consoles and games, and often invest in restoring and maintaining them. This has led to a market for replacement parts, repair services, and accessories designed to restore and preserve original hardware. The appreciation for retro gaming has also influenced modern game design. Many contemporary indie game developers have cited the Atari 2600 and early arcade games as inspirations for their work. They deliberately adopt retro aesthetics and simple, elegant gameplay because they recognize the enduring appeal of these earlier games. The success of modern retro-inspired games demonstrates that the fundamental appeal of the original games was not just about the novelty of the technology, but about the quality of the game design itself. Despite the best efforts of collectors and preservationists, some Atari 2600 games have been permanently lost. Games were sometimes created and released in such limited quantities or with such poor documentation that no copies survive. The knowledge about what games were created and released is sometimes incomplete or contradictory. Researchers continually discover references to games that may have existed but for which no copies have been found, creating an air of mystery around the lost software. The issue of preservation is ongoing. Original cartridges are susceptible to degradation over time. The ROM chips inside the cartridges can fail. The plastic cartridge cases can become brittle and deteriorate. The labels on the cartridges can fade and disappear. Without careful preservation and archival, original cartridges could become unreadable or unusable within decades. This makes emulation and software preservation all the more important, as they provide a backup if the original hardware becomes too degraded to function. Organizations dedicated to game preservation, such as the Video Game History Foundation and various academic institutions, have been working to preserve Atari 2600 software and hardware. These efforts include creating archival copies of games, documenting the technical specifications of the hardware, and preserving the knowledge and history of the platform. These preservation efforts ensure that even if all original hardware failed, the games and their history would not be lost. Beyond the technical and cultural impact of the Atari 2600, the console has an emotional and psychological legacy. For millions of people, the Atari 2600 is connected to cherished childhood memories. The beeps and boops of Atari 2600 games trigger nostalgia and emotional responses in people who grew up with the console. The experience of sitting in front of a television, joystick in hand, playing Pac-Man or Space Invaders with friends and family is a memory that many people treasure. This emotional connection to the Atari 2600 is one reason why the console continues to be celebrated and preserved. It's not just about the technical achievement or the historical importance, it's about the personal, human experiences and memories that the console enabled. For many people, the Atari 2600 was their first video game, their introduction to interactive entertainment. The console holds a special place in their personal histories. The nostalgia associated with the Atari 2600 is not merely about longing for the past. For many people, returning to Atari 2600 games in adulthood is a way of connecting with their younger selves, of revisiting formative experiences. There is something profound about sitting down with a game that you played 40 years ago, finding that it is still engaging and entertaining, and realizing that the joy and appeal of the experience is not diminished by the passage of time or the advancement of technology. If there is one final lesson to draw from the history of the Atari 2600, it might be about the enduring human drive to innovate and create, even within severe constraints. The engineers and programmers who created the Atari 2600 and the games for it were not starting from abundant resources or unlimited capabilities. They were working with what was available to them, pushing against the boundaries of what was technically possible, and creating something that changed the world. The same spirit of innovation and creativity lives on in the modern hobbyists and homebrew developers who continue to create games for the Atari 2600 more than 40 years after its initial release. They are not motivated by profit or commercial success. They are motivated by the challenge of the platform, by the desire to prove that elegant and engaging experiences can be created even with limited resources, and by love for the technology and the history it represents. The Atari 2600 stands as a testament to the power of vision and perseverance. Nolan Bushnell envisioned a future where interactive entertainment would come into homes around the world, and he had the drive and determination to make that vision real. The engineers who built the hardware had to invent solutions to problems that had never existed before. The programmers who created the games had to develop techniques and approaches that were entirely new. Through all the challenges and obstacles, they persisted, and the result was a technology that not only changed entertainment, but also launched an industry that has grown to dominate modern culture. The story of the Atari 2600 is a story of innovation and imagination, of daring to dream about what might be possible, and then working tirelessly to make that dream real. It is a story of triumph and disaster, of near total failure followed by unexpected recovery. It is a story of technology advancing, of markets growing and collapsing, of companies rising and falling. But perhaps most importantly, it is a story of the human creativity and determination that lies at the heart of technological progress. The Atari 2600 may no longer be manufactured, and it may no longer be the center of the video game industry. But its influence and legacy continue to reverberate through gaming and popular culture. Every video game console that has been released since owes a debt to the innovations and design principles established by the Atari 2600. Every programmer who has worked within constraints to create elegant solutions has followed in the footsteps of the programmers who worked on Atari 2600 games. For millions of people around the world, the Atari 2600 represents a formative moment in their lives, a moment when they first experienced the wonder and joy of interactive entertainment. The memories of playing these games, the feelings of accomplishment when beating a difficult level, the simple pleasure of competition with friends and family, these are the true legacy of the console. It is not just a piece of technology, but a gateway to experiences and memories that have shaped lives and personalities. As we move further into the future, with technology advancing at an accelerating pace, it becomes ever more important to preserve and celebrate the achievements of previous eras. The Atari 2600 represents an earlier stage of technological evolution, a moment when the possibilities were limitless, but the tools were limited. By preserving and studying the Atari 2600, we preserve an important chapter in the history of human creativity and innovation. The Atari 2600 will likely continue to be appreciated and celebrated for generations to come, not just by people who remember playing it, but by new generations discovering it for the first time. In a world where technology changes at a dizzying pace, where the newest and most powerful is always being superseded by something faster and more capable, there is something comforting and timeless about the simplicity and elegance of an Atari 2600 game. A world rendered in a few colors and simple shapes has a clarity and purity that is increasingly rare in contemporary media. The story of the Atari 2600 reminds us of something important about technology and human nature. It reminds us that progress is not always linear or predictable. It reminds us that innovation can come from unexpected places, and that vision and determination can overcome enormous obstacles. It reminds us that what endures is not always what is newest or most powerful, but what speaks to something deep in the human experience. A game that can be described in a single sentence and rendered with a handful of pixels can touch the heart and inspire the mind in ways that much more sophisticated technology sometimes cannot. As you drift now into sleep, allow the gentle rhythms of the Atari 2600 to carry you. Imagine the soft beeps and boops of the sound chip, the simple shapes moving across the screen, the satisfying feeling of controlling something within this digital world. Imagine yourself back in a living room in the 1980s, the glow of the television reflecting in your eyes, the world outside forgotten as you focus intently on the game before you. The console sits silently beneath the screen, a small box of wood and plastic and silicon, unassuming in appearance but vast in the worlds and experiences it contains. The Atari 2600 was more than just a machine. It was a door opening into a new world of possibility. It was a moment when technology reached a threshold where it became accessible and desirable to millions of ordinary people. It was the beginning of the transformation of entertainment, of the shift from purely passive consumption to interactive participation. It was the origin point of an entire industry and culture that has grown to dominate modern entertainment and communication. But beyond all of that, the Atari 2600 was a teacher. It taught programmers how to think creatively within constraints. It taught designers how to strip away unnecessary complexity and focus on the core of what makes an experience engaging. It taught the world that video games were not a passing fad, but a legitimate and powerful form of entertainment and art. It taught entrepreneurs that there were vast markets waiting to be discovered if you had the vision to see them and the courage to pursue them. The console also taught us about failure and recovery. The video game crash of 1983 was a catastrophic market failure that devastated the industry and nearly destroyed Atari. And yet, from that rubble, the industry rose again, stronger and more sophisticated than before. The Atari 2600, rather than being buried in that collapse, found a new role as an affordable entry point into gaming. The console that had been a market leader became a platform for people with limited budgets, and in doing so it remained relevant and profitable, even as more advanced consoles dominated the high end of the market. Each generation that encounters the Atari 2600 experiences it differently. For the generation that grew up in the late 1970s and 1980s, the Atari 2600 was the cutting edge of home entertainment technology. It was thrilling and exciting, a portal to worlds that seemed almost magical compared to the passive entertainment of television. For that generation, the Atari 2600 represents their childhood, their first experiences with video gaming, their formative moments of play and competition. For the generation that grew up in the 1990s and 2000s, the Atari 2600 represents history. It is a piece of the past, interesting and worthy of preservation, but experienced at a remove. This generation might play Atari 2600 games through emulation, or they might seek out original hardware for the retro gaming experience. They encounter the Atari 2600 not as cutting-edge technology, but as historical artifact, and they appreciate it for different reasons than the generation that grew up with it. For current and future generations, the Atari 2600 might become increasingly historical and abstract. Unless there is a conscious effort to preserve and celebrate the console and its games, younger people might only know it as a distant piece of gaming history, interesting but not directly relevant to their own experiences. This makes the work of preservation and documentation all the more important. By keeping the history of the Atari 2600 alive, we ensure that future generations can understand and appreciate the origins of video gaming and the innovations that led to the games and consoles they know today. The commercial success of the Atari 2600 had enormous economic impact, far beyond the immediate sales of the console and its games. The success of the console demonstrated to investors and businesses that there was a massive untapped market for interactive home entertainment. This recognition led to huge investments in video game companies and technologies. It spurred the development of competing consoles and the emergence of an entire ecosystem of companies dedicated to the video game industry. The Atari 2600 created hundreds of jobs, from manufacturing to software development to retail and distribution. It spawned entire industries dedicated to the support and peripherals for the console. Third-party manufacturers created alternative controllers, additional joysticks, light guns, and numerous other accessories. Publishers and developers emerged to create software for the system. Retail businesses dedicated to selling and renting games sprouted up across the country. The economic impact rippled outward in ways that were not anticipated or fully appreciated at the time. The Atari 2600 also transformed the business of entertainment. Before the Atari 2600, the entertainment industry was dominated by companies like film studios, television networks, and record labels. These were vertically integrated companies that controlled every aspect of their business, from production to distribution to retail. The Atari 2600 introduced a new model where a hardware manufacturer could create an ecosystem in which third-party software developers could create content. This model, which Atari pioneered with the 2600, became the dominant model for subsequent game consoles and eventually influenced how other industries, such as computers and mobile devices, structured their markets. The success of the Atari 2600 established the cartridge-based console as the dominant form of home video gaming for nearly 20 years. Every major console released in the 1980s and early 1990s, the Intellivision, ColecoVision, Nintendo Entertainment System, Sega Master System, and Super Nintendo Entertainment System, used the same basic cartridge model that the Atari 2600 pioneered. However, technological evolution continued. Each successive console was more powerful than the one before it. The processors became faster, the memory larger, the graphics more sophisticated, the sound capabilities improved, the cartridges themselves became larger and more complex as software became more ambitious. The Nintendo Entertainment System, which eventually dominated the market in the mid-1980s, was technically superior to the Atari 2600, but it followed the same basic design principles that Atari had established. Eventually, around the mid-1990s, the cartridge model began to be replaced by the CD-ROM model, which offered much larger storage capacity and lower manufacturing costs. This transition led to new consoles like the Sony PlayStation and Sega Dreamcast. However, the basic architecture, a dedicated console connected to a television, playing games from removable media with a standardized controller, continued to follow the template that the Atari 2600 had established. The success of the Atari 2600 was not a result of one person's genius or effort. It was a collaborative achievement involving dozens of talented individuals, each contributing their skills and vision to the overall project. However, certain individuals played particularly important roles in the console's development and success. Nolan Bushnell, as the founder of Atari and the visionary behind the home console concept, was the driving force that made the Atari 2600 possible. His insight that arcade games could be brought into homes and his determination to make this happen despite enormous technical challenges set the entire project in motion. Bushnell was not a hands-on engineer working on the technical details of the hardware, but rather a visionary leader who could articulate the possibility and inspire others to work toward making it real. Jay Miner, the chief hardware engineer, was responsible for the technical design of the console. Miner had to make crucial decisions about the processor, memory, and graphics capabilities of the system. His engineering decisions established the fundamental architecture that every Atari 2600 game would have to work within. Miner's ability to understand what was technically possible, combined with his creativity in finding elegant solutions to difficult problems, was crucial to the success of the hardware design. Rick Mora and Howard Scott Warshaw were programmers who pushed the limits of what the Atari 2600 hardware could do. Warshaw, in particular, is remembered for creating Yar's Revenge, a game that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the hardware capabilities and limitations and created an experience that was engaging and memorable despite the severe technical constraints. The work of these programmers established the patterns and techniques that would be used by countless other developers creating games for the platform. Carol Shaw was one of the first women in video game programming, and she created some of the most elegant and well-designed games for the Atari 2600. Shaw's work demonstrated that thoughtful game design was possible within the constraints of the platform, and her contributions helped establish standards for what a well-designed Atari 2600 game could be. Warren Robinette created Adventure, one of the most important games in Atari 2600 history. Adventure pioneered the adventure game genre and demonstrated that narrative and exploration could be meaningful elements of a video game. Robinette's work showed that the Atari 2600 could be more than just a platform for arcade game conversions. It could be a canvas for new forms of interactive storytelling. Each of these individuals, and many others whose names are less well known, contributed essential elements to the success of the Atari 2600. The console was not built by a single genius, but rather by a team of talented individuals, each bringing their own expertise and creativity to the project. This collaborative model of creating technology and entertainment would become increasingly important in the video game industry and in technology more broadly. One of the most important lessons taught by the Atari 2600 is that constraint and limitation can be sources of creativity and innovation rather than obstacles to overcome. The programmers and designers working with the Atari 2600 had to work within severe limitations. The processor was slow, the memory was minimal, the graphics capabilities were restricted, the sound was rudimentary. Rather than seeing these limitations as reasons to give up, the creators of Atari 2600 games saw them as challenges to solve creatively. This approach to design, where constraint is embraced and worked within rather than fought against, has had lasting influence on design philosophy in video games and beyond. Game designers have learned that a well-designed game with simple graphics and elegant gameplay can be more engaging than a technically impressive but poorly designed game. The principle that good design is about understanding your constraints and working within them rather than pretending they don't exist has become foundational to much of modern design thinking. The success of the Atari 2600 also demonstrated something important about human psychology and preference. People don't necessarily prefer games that are technically the most impressive or graphically the most advanced. People prefer games that are fun to play, that offer satisfying challenges, and that provide engaging experiences. The Atari 2600 games were not the most graphically impressive games available, but many of them were more engaging than more technically advanced games on competing platforms. This understanding has influenced game design philosophy for generations. The Atari 2600 emerged at a unique moment in history. The microprocessor revolution was in its early stages. Personal computers were just beginning to become a consumer product. Television was the dominant entertainment medium in American homes. The confluence of these technologies created an opportunity for the Atari 2600 to emerge and find an audience. The console arrived at a moment when American culture was becoming increasingly consumer-oriented and technology-focused. The 1970s had seen the emergence of the microcomputer and the beginning of the personal computer revolution. The 1980s would see the acceleration of this trend, with personal computers becoming increasingly common in homes and businesses. The Atari 2600 was part of this broader wave of technological change that was transforming American society. The cultural and social context of the era was also important. The 1980s were a time of economic growth and expanding consumerism in the United States. Families had more disposable income and were more willing to spend money on entertainment and consumer electronics. The Atari 2600 arrived at a moment when consumers were ready to embrace new forms of entertainment and were financially able to purchase them. The console might not have succeeded if it had arrived a few years earlier or later, in a different economic and cultural context. The story of the Atari 2600 offers several important lessons for modern innovation and entrepreneurship. The first is that vision and determination matter. Nolan Bushnell had a vision of interactive entertainment in the home, and he was determined to make it a reality despite enormous obstacles and skepticism. This determination and vision were essential to the success of the project. The second lesson is that timing matters. The Atari 2600 arrived at exactly the right moment, when the technology was mature enough to make it feasible. when consumers were ready to embrace the technology and when the market conditions were favourable. Being first is not always an advantage. Being first at the right time is what matters. The third lesson is that understanding your constraints and working creatively within them can lead to elegant solutions. The engineers and programmers who created the Atari 2600 and its software understood the limitations of the hardware and found creative ways to work within those limitations. Rather than waiting for better technology, they made the best of what was available to them. The fourth lesson is that quality matters, even if you can't have everything. After the video game crash, the video game industry recovered partly because Nintendo and others focused on quality and reliability. The Atari 2600 had suffered from an enormous amount of low-quality software. When Nintendo took control of the market by being selective about which games would be released, the industry recovered. This shows the importance of maintaining standards and not allowing quantity to overwhelm quality. As the people who remember the Atari 2600 from personal experience continue to age, the importance of preservation and documentation becomes increasingly urgent. The knowledge and expertise of the programmers, designers, and engineers who worked on the console is irreplaceable. The oral histories and personal accounts of the development process are invaluable for understanding not just the technical details, but also the creative and human aspects of the project. Many of the people who worked on the Atari 2600 are still alive, and efforts are underway to document their stories and preserve their knowledge. Interviews with programmers and designers have been conducted and preserved. Documentary films have been made. Books have been written. This work is crucial because once this generation passes, the direct human knowledge of the Atari 2600 development will be lost, and future researchers will either rely on secondary sources and documentation. The preservation of Atari 2600 hardware and software is also important. Original consoles and cartridges are aging, and without proper preservation, they will deteriorate. Emulation and digital preservation ensure that the software can continue to be experienced even if the original hardware fails. But there is also value in preserving working examples of the original hardware to allow future generations to experience the console as it was originally intended to be experienced. In retrospect, the visual and audio aesthetic of the Atari 2600 has taken on a kind of cultural significance that was not anticipated or even appreciated at the time. The simple pixel art graphics, the limited color palettes, the synthesized sounds, all of these were originally seen as limitations imposed by the technology. Today, these same aesthetic elements are often celebrated as beautiful and iconic in their own right. The blocky, pixelated graphics of Atari 2600 games have influenced contemporary visual culture. Pixel art has become a deliberate aesthetic choice in modern games and visual media, rather than a technological necessity. The retro aesthetic associated with the Atari 2600 is now seen as cool and appealing by people who never experienced the console as contemporary technology. The simple, clean look of Atari 2600 graphics is sometimes perceived as more timeless and elegant than more graphically complex but ultimately dated-looking games from later eras. The sound aesthetic of the Atari 2600, with its simple synthesized beeps and boops, has also become iconic. The theme music and sound effects of classic Atari 2600 games are instantly recognizable to millions of people. Modern electronic musicians and composers sometimes draw inspiration from the limited sonic palette of the Atari 2600, recognizing that the constraints actually led to distinctive and memorable sounds. Despite decades of research and documentation, the history of the Atari 2600 still contains mysteries and unanswered questions. There are lost games, titles that are known to have been developed and possibly released, but for which no copies exist. There are disputed stories about the development of certain games or features. There are technical details that remain unclear or controversial. The question of how many Atari 2600 consoles were actually sold has been a subject of historical debate. Different sources give different numbers, ranging from approximately 30 million to over 40 million units. The true number is difficult to determine because Atari sold hardware to retailers and distributors who then resold to consumers, so the exact final sales figures were not always carefully tracked or publicly disclosed. The true authorship of certain games is sometimes disputed or unclear. In some cases, multiple programmers worked on a single game, and the historical record doesn't always make it clear who was responsible for which parts of the game. In other cases, games were ported from one platform to another, and it's sometimes unclear who did the porting and how much modification was done. Beyond its literal historical and technological significance, the Atari 2600 has come to have metaphorical and symbolic meaning. It represents an era of innocence and wonder in video gaming, before the medium became commercialized and complicated. It represents a time when video games were simple and direct in their appeal, before they became vehicles for complex narratives and photorealistic graphics. The Atari 2600 also represents a kind of American optimism and entrepreneurship. The story of Nolan Bushnell and Atari is a classic American tale of a visionary entrepreneur spotting an opportunity, taking risks and creating a revolutionary product. It is a story of the American dream, of innovation leading to success and wealth, of changing the world through determination and creativity. For many people who grew up with the Atari 2600, the console represents a connection to their past and their childhood. Playing an Atari 2600 game as an adult can transport someone back to a time of innocence and wonder, evoking powerful nostalgic feelings. This emotional connection is one of the reasons why the Atari 2600 continues to be loved and celebrated decades after it was manufactured. As we look to the future, the Atari 2600 seems likely to remain relevant and celebrated, even as the technology of video gaming continues to advance in ways that would have seemed impossible to the engineers and designers of the 1970s. The console has already lasted longer in popular culture and the collective consciousness than many newer and technologically more advanced systems that came after it. This longevity is a testament to the quality of the design and the games created for the platform. The fundamental appeal of Atari 2600 games is not dependent on impressive graphics or complex audio. It is dependent on engaging gameplay, elegant design, and the joy of interactive experience. These qualities are not subject to obsolescence. A well-designed game from 1981 can still be engaging and fun in 2024, and will likely still be engaging in 2084. The Atari 2600 stands as a monument to the power of innovation, determination, and creativity. It stands as proof that revolutionary change can come from unexpected places, and that vision combined with hard work can transform the world. It stands as a reminder that the tools and constraints we work within can inspire creativity rather than limit it. And it stands as a beloved piece of popular culture and personal history for millions of people around the world. And so, our journey through the history of the Atari 2600 comes to an end, much as it must someday come to rest in the homes and collections of those who love it. The console sits quiet and still, no longer manufactured, no longer at the cutting edge of technology, and yet still capable of providing entertainment and joy to anyone who turns it on and inserts a cartridge. The Atari 2600 was not just a gaming console, it was a revolution that brought video games into homes around the world. It was a technological achievement that proved revolutionary experiences could be created with limited resources through creativity and determination. It was a platform that launched the careers of countless programmers, designers, and artists. It was a machine that shaped the childhoods and memories of an entire generation. It was a cultural phenomenon that changed the course of entertainment history. As you close your eyes now and drift into sleep, let the memory of the Atari 2600 accompany you into your dreams. Remember the simple controllers in your hands, the glowing television screen before you, the satisfaction of accomplishing goals in these simple digital worlds. Remember the laughter and competition with friends as you played these games together. Remember the sense of wonder and possibility that came from experiencing interactive entertainment for the first time. The Atari 2600 has become eternal, preserved in the memories of those who experienced it and in the digital and physical artifacts that remain. Though the console no longer dominates the market or commands the attention of the mainstream gaming world, it lives on in the hearts and minds of millions. It lives on in emulators running on modern computers. It lives on in the homebrew games still being created for the platform. It lives on in documentaries and books and in the conversations of enthusiasts who continue to celebrate and preserve its legacy. The beeps and boops that once filled living rooms across America still echo through cultural memory. The simple pixels that once moved across television screens remain vivid and beloved in the minds of everyone who played these games. The joy and wonder that people experience playing the Atari 2600 remains undiminished by time, untouched by technological progress, eternal in its simple purity. Rest now, knowing that you have journeyed through an important chapter in the history of technology and entertainment. Rest knowing that the Atari 2600, despite its humble origins and simple capabilities, changed the world. Rest knowing that the spirit of innovation and creativity that brought the Atari 2600 into existence continues to inspire new generations of creators and innovators. Rest in the peaceful knowledge that some things, once created with care and passion, endure forever. The Atari 2600 is gone but not forgotten. It is remembered by millions who lived through its era, and it is being discovered by new generations who appreciate it for its elegance, its simplicity, and its enduring appeal. The console that nearly failed, that was written off as a dead product during the crash of 1983, that was overtaken by newer and more powerful competitors, has become immortal through the love and respect of its community and through the careful work of those dedicated to its preservation. As your breathing slows and your consciousness begins to drift, let the story of the Atari 2600 carry you gently towards sleep. Think of pixelated shapes moving slowly across screens. Think of simple melodies made from synthesized sounds. Think of the wonder of discovering new worlds in these simple digital spaces. Think of the joy of connecting with others through shared gaming experiences. Think of the innovation and creativity that brought these simple games to life. The Atari 2600 was more than just a console. It was the beginning of something vast and transformative. It was the moment when the door opened to a new world of possibility. It was the spark that ignited an industry and a culture that continues to grow and evolve to this day. And so our story ends, as all stories must eventually end. But the Atari 2600, like the best of human creations, does not truly end. It transforms, it evolves, it lives on in new forms and new contexts. It lives on in the hearts of those who knew it and loved it. It lives on in the work of those who continue to create for it and celebrate it. It lives on in history, a testament to human creativity and innovation. Sleep now, dear listener. Let the gentle memory of the Atari 2600 guide you into dreams filled with digital adventures and simple, perfect joy. The console has rested now for decades, and so too should you rest, knowing that you have witnessed and understood the story of something truly special and truly important. Good night,